Hello everyone. I am the Macabre. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you from and what time are you watching now? Sit back and relax. Asterisk the Devil's Brew Covenant. The air clung thick as moss to skin, heavy with the burnt sugar stench of boiling molasses and the swamp's wet rot. La Luxure Brewery's grand reopening pulsed beneath paper lanterns strung over the dock, their light bleeding into the bayou's midnight haze. Hipsters in artfully torn flannel rubbed shoulders with local historians sipping flight samplers, all lured by flyers promising a taste of forgotten darkness. Boudica's black ale resurrected. The brewmaster hoisted a tulip glass of the infamous dark beer, its surface iridescent, like oil on well water. Toasts to the thirsty dead, he laughed, his teeth glinting too sharply. The crowd echoed, glasses clinking, unaware of the undertone beneath the ale's fig and clove bouquet, a necrotic sweetness, the ghost of something long buried. 3 drinkers at the bar froze first. A woman in a moth-eaten Civil War reenactor's dress, her toast halfway to her lips. A tattooed riverboat mechanic, his arm hooked in camaraderie. A doe-eyed college student recording the moment for a TikTok, their limbs locked mid-gesture, knuckles whitening around glass stems. Silence rippled outward. A smartphone clattered to the floor. The mechanic's head twitched, tendons creaking like rusty hinges, until his gaping mouth aimed at the ceiling. The student's camera captured at first thick black tears pooling in her lower lashes before spilling down her cheeks. Someone screamed. Bodies lurched back, overturning tables. The brewmaster dropped his glass. It shattered, releasing a whiff of ammonia and overripe plums. The 3 figures remained rigid, their faces settling into rictus grins, arms bent now like marionette limbs tangled in a puppeteer's discard pile. Paramedics found no pulse but noted the heat radiating from the corpses, a feverish warmth that fogged their 4 bags. The sheriff arrived chewing tobacco, his boots crunching shards of glass. "Christ on the cross," he muttered, staring at the black ichor dribbling from the student's nostrils into her acai bowl. Dr. Elias Carter's hands trembled as he uncapped a sample vial. The sheriff eyed the sweat blooming on Elias's collar. "They called you? Hell, Carter, you ain't even the best drunk in the room." Elias ignored him, swabbing the viscous fluid leaking from the mechanic's ears. It writhed faintly in the vial, alive with unseen fermentation. By dawn, the autopsy room stank of scorched hops and iron. Elias adjusted the overhead light, its glare catching the Y incision on the reenactor's chest. Her veins weren't collapsed, they were packed, bulging with what looked like caviar but dissolved on contact into a pitch-black slurry. "Methanol toxicity, my ass," he whispered, recalling the sludge's hiss against his latex gloves. In the bayou beyond the morgue's cracked window, a tugboat engine coughed to life. Dragging something heavy from the deep, the crew would later say. Something that wept rust and hummed an old song through its rivets. Elias popped 2 white tablets dry, the pills sticking in his throat. He thought of the brewery's ledger left open in the office, a shipping manifest dated 1873. Iron vat number 5. Contents: special bitters. He thought of the student's phone, still playing her video on loop in evidence, her final whisper before the toast. "Tastes like my grandma's cellar," when the sheriff tossed him a Ziploc bag of herbs found in the victim's pockets, thorny, reeking of anise and rot. Elias didn't need the lab. He'd seen those shriveled threads before, pressed inside his late father's journal. Next to a name scrawled in whiskey-stained cursive, Boudica. By noon, the first bloatflies emerged from the corpses' mouths. They didn't buzz. They sang. The tugboat's dragline groaned under the weight, its engine belching smoke that stained the dawn like watered-down ink. Crewman LeBlanc crossed himself as the iron vat breached the surface, its sides weeping rust in gelatinous strands. "Ain't right," he muttered, noting how the sludge sliding off the metal shimmered like beetles' wings. The dredge claw had punctured its belly, and now something inside thrummed a low hum that made the men's molars ache. By the time the sheriff arrived, buzzards already circled. Deputies pried open the vat's hatch with blowtorches, their flames hissing against metal marked with symbols not meant for daylight. The smell hit first, fermented earth and a sweetness like rotting orchids. Inside, 8 skeletons curved into a ring, finger bones clasping clay cups. Their skulls listed backward, jaws dislocated in eternal, silent screams. Amara Jolicoeur stood apart, arms folded tight over her bartender's apron. She didn't flinch when the sheriff tossed a cup into an evidence bag. The herbs inside crumbled to dust against the plastic spindly black stems, barbed seeds. Her grandmother's voice whispered through memory. Boudica brewed her poisons with devil's bit and wormwood, fed it to the men who chained her, watched them shrivel like slugs under salt. Elias arrived clutching a styrofoam cup of gas station coffee, his pupils pinpricks. He tripped over a root, spilling droplets that sizzled against a cluster of flycap mushrooms. "Jesus, it's leaching," he slurred, crouching to probe the vat's corrosion. The sheriff snorted, nudging a femur with his boot. "Y'all act like we ain't found Civil War bones before. Hell, this is Bayou Cane, we're built on dead folks." Amara slid a fingernail along the vat's interior. It came away smudged, oily green. "Not dead," she said. "Hungry." She pointed to the skeleton's ribs, each notched with 5 precise grooves. Teeth marks. Something fed off them slow, like sugarcane sucked dry. One deputy gagged into the reeds. The sheriff spat tobacco. Back at the morgue, Elias swabbed the green residue. His microscope revealed filaments squirming between lens slides, hyphae feeding on century-old rot. His notes spiraled. Not fungal. Not bacterial. Metabolic activity suggests predatory adaptation too. A fly landed on his wrist. He crushed it, smearing black ichor. By dusk, the vat was hauled to the brewery's back lot. The crew refused to touch it again. They'd heard things after sunset, wet clicks like a parched tongue against roof mouth. The brewmaster arrived with a forklift, his eyes bloodshot. "Historical relic," he grinned, patting the iron. "Gonna be our centerpiece." His breath smelled of cloves and bile. Amara found the old parish records that night. The 1798 trial transcripts crackled under her fingers. Boudica, enslaved at the original La Luxure distillery, accused of lacing her master's rum with hell's thirst. Witnesses described victims clawing at their throats, drinking lamp oil, brine, their own blood. The judge's final ruling: burn the witch. Salt the earth where she bled. At midnight, Elias stumbled into his garage lab. The green sludge now pulsed in its jar, casting phthalo shadows. He sliced into the tugboat crew's discarded gloves. The rubber dissolved on contact. When he licked his lips, a habit from his using days, his tongue blistered. The garage radio crackled to life, blaring static shredded Zydeco. Amara knelt by her ancestors' altar, lighting a black candle for protection. The flame bent westward, though the windows were sealed. Her asin rattle trembled unbidden on the shelf, gourds whispering, "Lima yo really owe you. The dead are calling." She unwrapped the herbs stolen from the vat and flinched. They'd regrown thorns overnight. In the bayou, bullfrogs fell silent as the dredge site bubbled. The water thickened, swallowing moonlight, while shapes beneath the surface unspooled like kelp. Fishermen would swear they heard laughter the next day, low and liquid, the kind that follows you home. By dawn, the first drowned dog washed ashore, its belly taut, tongue swollen purple. Around its neck, a collar of braided swamp grass, knotted in the shape of a noose. The video played on a loop, its pixelated horror flickering across the laptop screen in the sheriff's makeshift evidence room. Elias leaned in, the glow washing his face pallid. The college student's final moments stuttered, her head lolling as if pulled by marionette strings, hands shaking as she raised a mason jar of viscous, tar-black liquid to her lips. Her voice, warped by the phone's failing speaker, gurgled a mantra: "Poto miten nan soif." Amara's breath caught. "That's not Creole. It's older." Behind the victim, the brewery's shadowed walls seemed to pulse. Elias froze the frame. There in the corner, A figure blurred past, too tall, limbs jointed like a spider's. The student's eyes tracked it, glassy and unblinking, before she began chugging the sludge. Her throat bulged, tendons straining. Then the scream dissolved into static, punctuated by wet crunching sounds. Amara pressed a hand to her sternum, where her kanzo scars burned. She was reenacting Alwa's offering, force-feeding the soul to the crossroads. She pulled a flask of Claren from her bag, sprinkling rum over the laptop. The sheriff recoiled. "The hell you doing, voodoo lady?" She didn't answer. The laptop's fan whined, spewing a coil of smoke that smelled of burnt molasses. Elias retreated to his garage, the student's blood sample seething in its vial. His microscope revealed hyphae tunneling through her cells, transforming tissue into a spongy, ale-colored mass. He noted the mutation rate *exponential, anaerobic * before his vision blurred. His finger, slick with sweat, left a greasy smudge on the lens. Withdrawal, he told himself, ignoring the fungus-like tendrils now visible in his peripheral vision. Down at the docks, Amara found the dredge crew burning sage in a coffee can. LeBlanc nodded to the bayou. "Water's gone syrupy. Grab a stick, it'll stand upright." She dipped a hand, and the liquid coiled around her wrist like a serpent. A bullfrog floating belly up nearby burst, its inneries writhing with maggots that glistened unnaturally blue. The brewmaster hosted a midnight heritage tasting that evening, serving Boudica black ale in chalices shaped like human skulls. Hipsters filmed themselves chugging, daring each other to finish. One man collapsed before last call, clawing at his throat. "Just dehydrated," the brewmaster assured the crowd, refilling glasses. Security cameras later showed him pocketing a clump of the victim's hair, still attached to a scalp. Elias woke to a gurgling sound in his sink. The tap spat out a slug-like stream of black fluid. He tore apart the pipes, finding clots of hair and rot and a single thorned vine, sprouting from the U-bend. His hands shook as he torched it with a propane lighter. The scream it emitted matched the student's recording. Amara tracked down the desiccated herbs from the vat to a derelict plantation's overgrown cemetery. Beneath a statue of the Virgin Mary face eroded, hands replaced with rusted hooks, she unearthed a clay jar. Inside, finger bones and a Vev symbol drawn in ash. The moment she traced the sigil, roots erupted from the soil, snaring her ankles. She slashed free with a ritual dagger, but not before the roots latched onto her memories, flooding her mind with Boudica's final moments, fire, laughter, a whispered pact. The sheriff found Elias throwing up in the morgue parking lot. "You look like hell." Elias spat bile. "The fungus, it's airborne now. Spores in the fog last night. Check the weather radar." The sheriff squinted at his phone. The storm pattern swirled in a perfect spiral over La Luxure. "So," Elias grinned wildly, "that's not a storm. It's an inhalation." By dawn, 3 more bodies turned up in bathtubs, drowned in their own vomit. Each had fashioned crude funnels from garden hoses, rammed down their throats. Their phones, left recording, captured whispery voices urging, "Drink past the pain. She'll make you float." Amara cornered the brewmaster in his office, where he knelt before the iron vat. His eyes were jaundiced, lips cracked. "They want more," he hissed, clutching a ledger filled with names. Her acid rattle hissed as she flung powdered eggshell at him. He convulsed, vomiting live crickets that scampered into the vat's open mouth. At midnight, the bayou's tide reversed. Fish swam upside down. Cypress knees oozed a honey-like substance that drew swarms of flies until the flies began dissolving, wings melting into a mist that smelled of scorched whiskey. Elias, popping another pill, watched his bathroom mirror fog over. A handprint emerged, webbed with black veins. It wrote, "Toast to me." The rain came warm and thick, pooling in the brewery's parking lot with an iridescent sheen. Children splashed in it first, their laughter curdling to coughs as the water greased their skin with a film like rancid lard. By noon, Their mothers scrubbed them raw with lye soap, but the stains remained swirling patterns that matched the iron vat's engravings. Amara found Elias boiling bay leaves and graveyard dirt in his garage, a surgical mask dangling from one ear. "It's in the groundwater," he muttered, stirring a crusted pot. "The spores feed on saccharides. Sweat, saliva, souls." He lifted his shirt, revealing a lattice of green veins beneath his ribs. Amara slammed the pot lid shut. "You breathe near that vat again, you'll birth something that shouldn't be." The brewmaster's midnight livestream drew 20,000 viewers. He straddled the vat, shirtless, pouring ale over his head while subscribers sent skull emojis. "Y'all wanna see a real party trick?" He plunged his arm into the sludge up to the shoulder. When he pulled it out, the skin hung limp as a glove, revealing muscle threaded with black hyphae. The chat exploded. A donor named at Boudica's bride sent $1,000 and an address. At St. Genevieve's, the priest discovered his holy water font fizzing. He dipped a crucifix, the silver blistered. Parishioners brought him jars of the rain. By dusk, he'd locked himself in the confessional, whispering "Mea maxima culpa" as his pores wept a sticky, sweet resin. They found him fused to the wooden bench, his mouth stretched around the baptismal hose, body desiccated into a fleshy raisin. Elias cracked open Boudica's trial records. Between the witch accusations lay a plantation ledger entry. Lost 3 field hands to the thirsting sickness. Prescribed 10 lashings to cure superstition. A splatter on the page fluoresced under his UV light handprints, tiny, a child's. His own fingertips tingled, nails blackening at the cuticles. Amara rode to the dredge site, the oars leaving trails of bioluminescent algae. She dropped a chicken heart wrapped in blue silk into the water. It floated, then jerked under as if hooked. The bayou belched a coffin-sized bubble that burst, unleashing a scream in Cajun French. "Li Pam Wen. She's mine." Amara's asin split down the middle, spilling desiccated spider eggs. The sheriff's deputies deserted after finding the jail cells clogged with finger-thick vines. They writhed, thorns scoring the bars, as the detained drunkards sang lullabies in unison. One inmate grinned, his teeth replaced by bottle caps. "She's real pretty when she hums," he sighed, before biting off his tongue. The sheriff torched the building, but the fire bloomed violet, sprouting mushroom caps that pulsed like eyeballs. Elias dreamt of Boudica, not the vengeful spirit from Stories a Girl, maybe 12, grinding herbs with a mortar while the master's shadow loomed on the distillery wall. She whispered to the vat, her tears thinning the molasses. "Mange ca, vous salades," she hissed. "Eat it, you bastards." When Elias woke, his pillow was damp with something that ate through the cotton, leaving a head-shaped hole. The brewmaster delivered 6 oak barrels to the town council, labeled Limited Edition Resurrection Reserve. Councilmen toasted at sunset, gagging at the first sip. "Tastes like wet ash," one coughed. By moonrise, they'd gouged their tongues out with letter openers, arranging the flesh on meeting minutes like effigy dolls. Security footage showed the brewmaster licking the bloodied blades clean. Amara broke into the plantation's ruins, following the child's handprints to a collapsed well. Inside, dolls hung from the roots' cornhusk bodies, heads made of muscadine grapes long mummified. Their chests bore nail holes. She placed Elias's stolen pill bottle at the well's rim. A tendril lashed out, crushing it to powder. The wind carried Boudica's whisper, "Pas de soulagement." No relief. The sheriff kicked in Elias's door, reeking of bourbon and burnt hair. "We're burnin' the brewery." Elias shook his head, hunched over a broth of infected tissue and Adderall. "You burn it, the spores." The sheriff aimed his revolver at the vat sludge. "I'll kill her goddamn recipe." A phone buzzed. His missing deputy's number flashed, followed by a text, a photo of the sheriff's wife asleep in their bed, lips sewn shut with thorny vines. They converged at midnight, Amara with a goatskin drum, Elias with a jerry-rigged flamethrower, the sheriff with a mason jar of his wife's tears. The brewery loomed, its walls now veined with pulsating rot, the vat's hum tuned to a perfect middle C. Above it, storm clouds spiraled into a gaping mouth. The brewmaster waited atop the vat, his jaw unhinged, singing a lullaby in a little girl's voice. The brewery breathed. Its walls rippled with veins that pulsed black under the storm's sickly glare. Amara beat her drum in a petro rhythm, the goatskin head slick with her blood. "Get ready," she shouted over the brewmaster's warbling lullaby. Elias thumbed his flamethrower's ignition, its nozzle dripping homemade napalm that reeked of pill-binder chemicals. The sheriff clutched his wife's tears, the jar fogged with her breath still trapped inside. The brewmaster's jaw hinged wider, dislocating with a wet pop. His tongue unfurled a rope of knotted hair and rusted nails and scraped the vat's rim. The slurry inside surged, birthing a figure that rose like a wax effigy melting in reverse. Bones snapped into place, draped in fungus mimicking a plantation dress. Boudicca's face remained half-formed, one eye socket blooming with corpse flowers, the other a void that hummed. Amara's drum faltered. The thing turned its flowered eye toward her, and her canzo scars ruptured, leaking larvae. She collapsed, chanting through clenched teeth, "Papa Legba, Ouvri Bay Pomwen." Elias sprayed fire, but the flames swerved, curving into the vat's maw-like offerings. Boudicca's hand stretched toward the sheriff, skeletal fingers hooked. His revolver clicked uselessly. The brewmaster's body split like overripe fruit. Vines erupted, piercing the sheriff's shoulders, yanking him into the air. He dangled, kicking, as his wife's jar shattered. Her tears vaporized into mist that stank of laudanum. Boudicca inhaled, and the mist coiled into her hollow chest. Her voice, dual-tone child and crone, shook the earth. "Je ver les ingrats. Bring me the ungrateful." Elias dropped the flamethrower. His green-veined hand plunged into his jacket, retrieving a syringe of black spores mixed with his Adderall stash. "Feast on this," he slurred, jabbing it into his neck. His veins bulged, pupils dilating into voids. Boudicca recoiled as he vomited a geyser of bioluminescent bile. The sludge sizzled where it struck her, etching Vev symbols she couldn't escape. Amara seized the moment. She tore open her drum, withdrawing a mummified hawk's claw. Plunging it into her ruptured scars, she drew forth a maggot-coated ribbon, her grandmother's MOKO. Boudicca howled as Amara lashed the ribbon around her throat. "Nan Dizef, nu tout nu soif," Amara chanted. "In the desert, we all thirst." The vat cracked. Foaming ale flooded the lot, dissolving concrete. The sheriff fell, vines withering to dust. He crawled toward the brewmaster's remains, grabbing a rusted valve handle. "Elias," he roared. The doctor staggered, half his face fungal mush, and aimed his dying lighter at the spill. Boudicca writhed, her form destabilizing. Amara's ribbon tightened, the maggots spelling liberté in scarred flesh. "You fed them hate," Amara gasped. "Now choke on it." The storm-split moonlight hit the carnage. Boudicca's flowered eye petrified, her void eye imploded, sucking the remaining slurry into a miniature cyclone. The sheriff jammed the valve handle into the vat's fissure. Elias flicked the lighter. Flame met spill, racing up the ale river. 4-3 heartbeats, the world whited out. Silence. Dawn revealed a scorched crater. Amara knelt in cinders, her drum ashes. The sheriff clutched his wife's empty jar, its glass frosted with hoarfrost shaped like thumbprints. Elias was gone, only his lab coat remained, sleeves smoldering with a child's handprint in lichen green. 3 miles downstream, fishermen netted a skeleton shackled to an iron vat fragment. Its ribcage cradled a corked bottle of murky liquid. When the sheriff arrived, one fisherman whispered, "It's still brewing." Inside the bottle, something fizzed. In Baton Rouge, a college kid ordered La Luxure's Resurrection Reserve off the dark web. The label bore a new motto, "Every sip a revolution." The bottle sat on the sheriff's evidence shelf for a week, sweating a dark ichor that ate through the wood. His wife refused to touch it, her lips still stitched with phantom thorns. At night, she sleepwalked to the bayou, whispering recipes in a voice like grinding sugar cane. He considered smashing the bottle, but the vat's hum still pulsed in his molars, a threat tuned to his heartbeat. Amara rebuilt her asin with cypress bark and the vertebrae of a raven. She'd find Elias's lab coat some mornings, draped over her altar, reeking of absinthe and mycelium. "You're not done," she'd mutter, tossing it into the hearth. It always reappeared. In Baton Rouge, the college kid hosted a resurrection party. His dorm room flickered with black candles as 10 students toasted their $500 bottle. The liquid moved on its own thick, mercurial, coating their throats like oil. By dawn, their skin had translucent patches, throats whistling through gill-like slits. They wandered into the Mississippi, singing in a language that made carp leap onto the banks, suffocating for a taste. Amara tracked the bottle's path through backwoods markets and cryptomining hubs. Each buyer uploaded reaction videos, influencers gagging theatrically, their followers swarming comments with "so edgy" smiling face with heart eyes until the footage glitched. Clipped frames showed tendrils erupting from their eye sockets, spelling Boudica in cursive rot. The sheriff's wife went missing after heavy rain. He found her in their garden, knees buried in mud, uprooting azaleas with her teeth. Her belly distended, stretch marks glowing faintly green. "She's hungry," his wife giggled, stuffing soil into her mouth. "Says keep the sheriff sweet." He handcuffed her to the bed, listening to her recite sugar trade ledgers from 1823 until sunrise. Fishermen dragged the flooded plantation's remains, netting bone flutes and musket balls. Teenagers looted them for TikTok trends, blowing into femurs to summon vibe check ghosts. One video went viral. A girl's irises filmed fungal filaments forming the word liberté before her head burst like a champagne cork. The bottle in frame? Half empty. Amara burned her ancestors' altar. Smoke curled into a woman's shape, reaching for her. "You don't own me," she hissed, salting the ashes. That night, her new asin rattled awake, its gourds vomiting live spiders that scurried northward. She followed their trail to a derelict sugar refinery, its smokestacks oozing the same iridescent rain. The sheriff drank. Not the bottle he'd poured its contents into the town's water tower, but bourbon, neat, until his hands steadied. At a town hall meeting, he blamed chemical spills. Parents demanded the brewery's carcass be bulldozed. He nodded, already knowing the backhoes would malfunction, their diesel fuel fermenting into something cloying and alive. Elias manifested at a methadone clinic 3 states over, skin grafted with lichen. He scribbled equations while muttering about spores in the opioid supply. Nurses found his bed sprouting toadstools shaped like tiny fists. When they moved him, his body collapsed into a dandelion clock puff of filaments. The wind carried him southwest. At the refinery, Amara confronted a new vat corroded steel stamped La Luxure 2024. Inside, a slurry of TikTok phones and sugar beets simmered. The air thrummed with a familiar hunger. She hesitated, then lobbed a Molotov. Flames birthed a shadow that clung to hers, whispering, "You'll thirst." "They all do." The sheriff's wife chewed through her handcuffs. She now teaches night classes at the community college. Fermentation sciences. Her students adore the extra credit siphoning liquid from the increasingly sentient water tower. The syllabus promises a field trip to the plantation's historic fermentation sites. In Brussels, a craft brewery adds Louisiana sugarcane to its revolutionary saison. The first batch, still fermenting, already answers to the name Boudica. No one notices the barrel room's walls sweating, or how the harvest machines groan like women laughing. The hollow pact. The hollows clutched the corpse like a jealous lover. Morning mist hung low over the Appalachians, seeping into the seams of Harlan Wakefield's ATF windbreaker as he picked his way down the ravine. The air stank of petrichor, and something sharper beneath it burnt sugar, maybe, or rotting peaches left to blister in a jar. Sheriff's deputies had marked the site with a red bandana tied to a hickory branch, its fabric limp with moisture. They hadn't touched the body. No one sane would have. The dead bootlegger sat propped against the lightning-blasted oak as if resting mid-toast, left arm crooked upward, fingers curled around an invisible glass. His right hand had been thrust deep into his own splintered ribcage, submerged to the wrist in a cavity glistening with mucus-yellow resin. Harlan crouched, bile rising as he registered the posture. Not rigor mortis. The joints had been methodically unstrung, collarbones popped from sockets, pelvis wrenched backward into a makeshift chair. The man's face was the worst part, lips peeled into a grin too wide for his jaw, teeth cracked from the pressure of whatever had reshaped him. A laugh frozen without sound. "Found him just past sunup," muttered Deputy Crane, lingering 10 paces uphill. The man's flashlight beam trembled across the undergrowth. Trapper called it in. Said the crows wouldn't come near. Not even the flies. Harlan leaned closer. Flesh around the chest wound had curdled inward, edges blackened as though seared. Nestled among the ribs, half submerged in a swamp of congealed tissue, sat a quart-sized mason jar. Its glass glowed faintly jaundice, swirling with sediment that clung to the sides like sucked marrow. The label, browned with age, bore 3 words in spidered calligraphy: "The Widow's Blessing." He'd heard that name once before. His granddaddy's whiskey-soaked bedtime stories, tales of a Depression-era shine that could open a man's third eye straight to perdition. The Blackridge clan's crown jewel, outlawed after a dozen revenuers turned up blind and babbling in 27. The last surviving batch supposedly burned in Hester Blackridge's stillhouse the night they lynched her. Stale breath hit the back of his neck. Crane had crept closer, his sweat carrying the vinegary tang of fear. "We had a preacher went missing last spring. Folks up at Dry Fork Creek swear they saw his pickup parked near the old Blackridge acreage a week, for they found him." The deputy's Adam's apple bobbed. His hands, they was fixed like this too, holding nothing but air. Harlan snapped a gloved hand toward the jar. The resin gave with a moist click, releasing a sweetness that made his molars ache. Honey left to ferment in a coffin. As he lifted it, liquid inside shifted, threads of amber separating like oil stirred in a pan. A hairline crack near the lid seeped black fluid. Then the smell hit. Rotting wildflower petals. Distilled vomit. Gasoline. It flooded his sinuses, metallic and cloying, and suddenly he was 8 years old again, sneaking sips from his uncle's fruit jar behind the barn. Same throat scorch. Same greasy aftertaste that lingered for days. But beneath it now pulsed something older, hungrier, a reek that scratched at the reptilian core of his brain. "Get away, get away, get away!" Crane retched into the leaf litter. Harlan spun, jar clutched to his chest, just as the corpse's head lolled toward him. A wet snap echoed from its throat. The grin widened, jaw unhinging with the creak of green timber, and a single word rasped out on a breath that stank of charred hickory. "Proof!" The deputy screamed. Harlan dropped the jar. It struck a root but didn't shatter, rolling downhill into mist that had thickened to the consistency of rendered fat. When he looked back, the corpse's face was still again mouth sealed, arms slack as if the last 60 seconds had been siphoned straight from a fever dream. But Crane's flashlight lay abandoned in the mud, and up in the oak's scorched branches, something rattled. 12 empty mason jars strung on rusted wire, clinking like a toast to the hollow's new guest. The still house hunched in the woods like a rotted molar, its plank walls swollen with decades of damp. Calla Varnes traced the hex marks carved above the doorway, crude slashes overlapping in a mimicry of snakeskin. Her grandmother's voice hissed in memory. Blackridge women don't keep diaries. They stitch secrets into the dead. Inside, cobwebs sagged with the weight of moth carcasses. Light sluiced through bullet holes in the ceiling, illuminating a workbench crusted with amber droplets. Harlan lingered near the door, gloved hands jammed in pockets. "You sure this is where they hid it?" Calla didn't answer. Her thumbs brushed the possum bones in her coat, warmth blooming as the spirits prickled. "Left." under the false floor. She kicked aside a warped stave, revealing planks streaked with a stain too deep for rust. Her boothiel found the soft spot. The ledger waited in a cavity slick with black mold, wrapped in what felt like human hair. Harlan gagged when she hauled it out. "Christ, is that?" "Tanned hide," Calla murmured. The cover's texture raised gooseflesh too smooth, too poreless. She flipped it open. Hester's spidery script crawled across pages swollen with moisture. Ink bloomed into vein-like patterns. June 12, 1926. Laid Brother Jepson to rest in the mash bed. His widow drank 3 fingers of the king's libation and swore she heard his voice in the outhouse privy. The debt is balanced. Harlan's flashlight flickered. That a gangland murder log? A recipe book? Her nail traced Hester's marginalia, a horned figure drawn in what looked like menstrual blood. See these tallies? She's tracking sacrifices per barrel. 4 quarts of shine requires a quart of something else. The next entry turned her stomach. Harvested Silas Macready post-toasting. His marrow clarified batch number 9 beyond expectation. The king approves. A draft snaked through the room. Pages fluttered ahead of Calla's fingers, slapping open to a spread smeared with fingerprints older than her grandmother. The left page detailed purification rituals involving copper coils and adder tongues. The right depicted 12 stick-figure men hanging from a tree, tongues swollen, their feet dipped in a boiling kettle. Beneath it, Hester's hand had gouged a single phrase, a baker's dozen for the king's oven. Harlan leaned in. Look at the date. October 31st, 1927. The final entry. Calla's breath hitched as she read aloud. The fools think fire will quiet him. They'll truss me like a Yule hog, but the king's already in the yeast. Every sip's a second noose. Every drunk his, the rest was obliterated by a handprint, its edges flaking brown. Something skittered in the rafters. Harlan swung his light upward, catching a raven's emerald-eyed glare. The bird croaked, dropping a clump of moss. It hit the ledger with a wet slap, unfurling into a nest of desiccated spiderlings. Calla recoiled. The pages were moving, not flipping, undulating. Hester's ink squirmed like caterpillars in reverse, letters reassembling into fresh sentences. A map emerged, dotted with creek names she'd never heard. Snakebite Holler. Widow's Proof Spring. A path snaked toward a symbol in red, a crown of mismatched antlers. Photograph this, she ordered, thrusting the ledger at Harlan. Her hands burned as if she'd plunged them into a hornet's nest. Now, before it changes again. He fumbled his phone. The raven launched itself at the lens, screeching. Shots rang out not from the phone, but outside, echoing through the hollows. Both froze. 3 seconds. 4. A distant whoop rolled over the ridges. Poachers. Harlan's jaw tightened. Calla stared at the ledger's shifting ink. The crown now bled into a crude noose. Earlier, people found that bootlegger's corpse near here. You told me. Quarter-mile west. Her finger tapped the map's antlered crown. That's his death site. Hester's not just chronicling old murders. Her bones hummed as the truth clicked. She's tracking the king's new converts. The raven dive-bombed, claws snatching a tuft of Calla's hair. She swatted, and the ledger slipped, splayed open against the dirt. A faint gurgle rose from its pages. Between lines of text, something dark and viscous began rising, the stench of yeast and gangrene swelling thick as a throat. Harlan grabbed her arm. Time to go. They burst into twilight air turned jaundiced by storm clouds. Behind them, the stillhouse door slammed. Not from wind. Something rhythmic thudded against the wood. 3 strikes. Pause. 3 more. A toast in Morse code. Calla didn't look back. Her pocket weighed hot and sudden. She reached in, fingers closing around a cold glass lip. The mason jar from the corpse's ribs sat nestled against her thigh, impossibly intact, its label now bearing a fresh line. The King's Welcome. The lab smelled of scorched sugar and formaldehyde. Harlan watched through safety glass as Dr. Lin prodded the viscous sample with a pipette, syrupy, iridescent, like crank oil floating in a puddle of fermented sap. It had arrived in a blast-proof case, triple-sealed after the jar from the tree corpse made a CDC tech vomit into an eyewash station. Behaviors inconsistent. Lin's voice crackled through the intercom. The substance twitched under her touch, recoiling into a coiled shape that made Harlan think of a rattlesnake ready to strike. pH matches ethanol, but it's hyperabsorbent. Watch. She dripped distilled water into the petri dish. The liquid flexed, engulfing the droplets in a violent ripple. For a heartbeat, the mass resembled a human tongue. And the volatility? Harlan asked. Lin nodded to a cage bolted to the ceiling. A robotic arm hovered above a sealed beaker, its contents glowing faintly. 10 milliliters vaporized a steel drum in our initial test. Energy output suggests nitroglycerin, but the burn pattern, she pulled up a photo. Scorch marks radiating from the blast site in claw-like tendrils. Your killer isn't just dosing victims. Their guts are becoming IEDs wrapped in skin. He kept seeing the corpses grin. Proof. That word buzzed in his molars like a bad amphetamine high. Cause of ignition? Ambient heat's enough. Body temp. Friction. The sample convulsed, splattering the dish. Lin jerked back. Or agitation. It hates being touched. His phone buzzed Kala's third text. Yeast cultures match pre-prohibition strain. Check Hester's arrest report. He zoomed into the grainy photo she'd sent. A 1927 evidence inventory listing, 12 vials timber rattler venom, seized from Blackridge Stillhouse. The species went extinct in '43. Got a live one. Lin's grad student, Perez, waved from the mass spectrometer. His screen displayed a molecular model, a helix of carbon dotted with proteins shaped like hooked fangs. There's a peptide here that shouldn't exist. Matches venom glands, but spliced with fungal alkaloids? Like it's bred into the venom. Harlan's scalp prickled. Can you source it? If I had a live Crotalus appellaceus and a mycologist who enjoys losing fingers, maybe. Perez laughed nervously. But look at this. He overlaid 2 chromatograms, one from the corpse's jar, another from a shine batch seized in a 08 meth sting. The graphs aligned perfectly. Same chemical signature. Perez whistled. Either your killer's got a museum quality stash, or someone's reverse engineering extinction. The lab lights flickered. Across the room, the caged beaker began to sweat. Harlan stepped closer. Black droplets oozed down the glass, hissing where they hit the floor. The liquid inside had darkened to arterial red. You venting the fumes? Lin frowned at her monitors. We haven't heated it. A shriek tore from the spectrometer. Perez's screen flooded with error codes as the molecular model unraveled into a snarl of jagged lines. The robotic arm jerked spasmodically, lowering toward the volatile beaker. Override the system. Lin lunged for the control panel. Too late. The arm smashed the beaker. Harlan hit the deck as the blast wave cracked the safety glass. A roar like a diesel engine backfiring filled the room, followed by a wet pop. When he looked up, tendrils of smoke coiled beneath the ceiling vents, phosphorescent and oddly deliberate, a horned shadow flickering in the haze. Perez moaned. His left arm glistened crimson, the skin peeled away in spiral strips. Lin crouched beside him, shouting for biohazard protocols. Harlan's phone buzzed again. Kala. Venom isn't extinct. The King's converts are milking it. He stared at the blackened ceiling. The smoke had etched a pattern into the tiles, 12 interlocked circles, each containing a droplet of charred matter. An ancient symbol, he realized. A toast ring. 3 miles away, in the belly of a derelict Baptist church, a gilded barrel burbled. The honeyed slime inside swelled, pressing against the staves. It pulsed once, twice, In the lab's ruined spectrometer, a single venom peptide stirred. Kerosene lamps painted the derelict church in feverish streaks. Harlan knelt beneath the pulpit, chisel prising up floorboards that oozed a resinous sweat. Kala knelt beside him, her shadow writhing on the wall as the blade bit deeper. The wood gave with a groan, exhaling a stench that straddled honey and gangrene. The journal lay swaddled in the shed skin of a timber rattler, its scales still iridescent after 90 years. Kala unwrapped it with ritual slowness. Inside, a moonshiner's shaky hand confessed horrors in faded pencil. September 14, 1932. Hester made us sign in blood and shine. The king don't take kindly to quitters. Harlan's headlamp caught a child's smudged fingerprint beside an entry. Weaned little Jim off milk this week. Fed him drippings from the tribute barrel instead. His eyes glowed proper when he laughed. Tribute barrel? Kala's thumb smoothed the paper, coming away tacky. She sniffed. Snake venom and saffron? A muffled thrum vibrated through the floor. Beneath them, in the crawlspace, 12 pairs of boot soles stood arranged in a perfect circle. The corpses were mummified but intact, Union Army uniforms fused to desiccated flesh. Each man's jaw hung slack, mouths widened into permanent black O's. From their throats dangled rope-like tendrils of a substance too thick for spider silk. Revenuers, Harlan muttered. One's brass buttons bore the U.S. Revenue Service eagle. The Fed's Hester supposedly killed during Prohibition. Kala's bone pendant swung low over the journal. The king demands a baker's dozen but settles for 12 if you knead their lungs with angel's breath. She recoiled. Angel's breath was Depression-era slang for cyanide. The thrumming intensified. Harlan aimed his light between the floor joists. A liquid shimmered beneath the corpses, viscous and iridescent, filling the crawlspace like a black mirror. As he stared, a bubble swelled on its surface, a perfect ocular globe that rotated to meet his gaze. "Don't." Kala grabbed his wrist. "It remembers." In the journal's final pages, the author's script disintegrated into frenzied scratches. Hester tricked us. The pact ain't for prosperity, it's a chain gang contract. King keeps your heart beating so he can crack it open again and again. Tried to burn the still. Woke up next dawn with my ashes already cooling in the jar. They make U.S. drink that a gunshot cracked overhead. They scrambled up to find Deputy Crane pale under the chapel's collapsed steeple. His smoking service revolver aimed at a revenuer's corpse now propped against the confession booth positioned mid-stride, one skeletal hand clutching Crane's abandoned flashlight. "It wasn't. I just turned around and..." Crane stammered. Kala approached the mummy. Greenish liquid seeped from its ear, pooling into a trail that led toward the crawlspace hole. "You disturbed their honey." "Honey?" Crane's laugh bordered on hysterical. "Lady, there's a river of crazy under this." The corpse's head whipped toward him. Jaw unhinged, it vomited a rope of black ooze that struck Crane's face with a meaty slap. He screamed, clawing at the substance as it twisted, burrowing into his nostrils. Harlan drew his sidearm. Too late. Crane's body jackknifed. His uniform split along the spine as something pushed through a glistening, segmented tail that lashed toward Kala. She ducked, pulling Harlan down as the stinger struck the pew behind them, splintering oak. The crawlspace roared. Kala's bloodied fingers clawed through her coat lining, flinging bone dust into the chaos. The revenuers recoiled, giving Harlan one heartbeat to grab the journal and shove her toward the exit. Outside, the night smelled of lightning. They sprinted for the tree line as the church imploded, not collapsing, but contracting, floorboards snapping inward like a ribcage. Crane's mutated shriek chased them, harmonizing with a deeper resonance from below. A melody. Harlan tripped, palm skidding across a rock streaked with that same iridescent ooze. It squirmed into his scrapes. "Welcome," whispered the hole in his glove. Kala hauled him up, chanting something guttural. The bones in her pocket scorched through denim, smoking. Behind them, the earth convulsed. Trees tilted as the crawlspace's black honey breached the surface, a sentient levee cresting the ridge. In his fist, the journal vibrated. Harlan risked a glance. The moonshiner's last entry now bore fresh text, scrawled in his own sweat. Your name's in the next toast. The stillhouse chimney belched smoke that curled like a hangman's rope. Calla waded through knee-deep mounds of fungal growth, the air so thick with spores her flashlight beam looked snow-blinded. Beside her, Harlan wheezed a wet, clicking sound. The infection had spread. Black veins forked beneath his jawline, pulsing in time with the creak of rusted chains overhead. 12 nooses swung empty in the rafters. Below each, a mason jar boiled on coal-fed burners, their contents hissing against the glass. Calla recognized the labels. Dry Fork Preacher. Deputy Crane. Harlan Wakefield. The last jar seethed with a crimson froth, its surface mottled with shapes like screaming faces pressed against hot wax. Harlan sagged against a support beam. His left eye had filmed over, pupil dilated to a black moon. Burn them, he slurred, tongue swollen. Recipe book said fire. Fire's what birthed him. Calla thumbed the bullet hole in her grandmother's bones. The Revenuers' ghosts had whispered the rest Hester's last trick. The king didn't haunt the shine. He was the shine. Every burnt barrel had atomized him into the hollers, a poison mist haunting the lungs of drinkers for generations. The jars weren't his prison. They were lungs. A guttural buzz vibrated the still. Copper tubing shrieked as pressure bulged the seams. From the ruptures oozed a fluid that defied gravity, creeping up the walls to coalesce into a figure straddling the roof beams. Antlered, multi-limbed, slick as a newborn calf. The king tilted his head a jagged crack down the skull and spoke through the boilers. Toast the 13th. Harlan's jar erupted. Calla dove as glass shrapnel grazed her cheek. The liquid inside flowed toward Harlan, snaking into his mouth, ears, the weeping cracks in his skin. He convulsed, bones audibly reforming. When he stood, his right arm ended in a serpent's rattle, vertebrae exposed and clattering. Calla. His voice layered Harlan's timbre over something seismic. She didn't tell you about the ledger's last page. Her boot slipped on a patch of leech-like mold. The journal fell open, revealing the moonshiner's final entry now complete. A sketch of Hester's lynching, her body contorted mid-transformation, antlers splitting her scalp, jaw unspooling into a proboscis. The caption, "A king needs a queen to breathe." Harlan the king lunged. Calla swung the ledger like a shield. Pages split, unleashing a wail as centuries of trapped spirits billowed forth. Hungry things. The Revenuers materialized first, spectral revenants shackled to the king's will. Then the others, bootleggers, trappers, Crane's mangled soul trailing his stingered tail. They descended on the king in a storm of teeth and rusted revolvers, buying her seconds. Calla scrambled for the burners. She smashed jars 2 at a time, each rupture spraying vapors that scalded her hands. Dry Fork Preacher released a howl that cracked the stillhouse foundation. Deputy Cranes burst into a hornet swarm. The king howled, his form unraveling with every shattered jar. Harlan's face flickered in the maelstrom. "The bullets," he choked. "In my pocket." She found the corroded .38 rounds Hester's hand-cast lead, each etched with the same horned sigil. Calla rammed one into her derringer. The king's antlers speared down, pinning her thigh. His breath stank of overripe corn mash and open graves. "Little vessel," he crooned. "You'll hold me nicer." Calla pressed the barrel to Harlan's flickering temple. "I'm a Blackridge." She squeezed. "We don't hold. We bury." The shot rang hollow. Harlan's body crumpled, but the king's shriek split the sky. His form collapsed into a black fog, thrashing as the stillhouse beams groaned. Calla limped toward daylight, bone pendant melting against her chest. Outside, the hollows burned. Not with fire, but with a fermented rot as the king's essence curdled in the soil. Trees split, vomiting sap that hardened into shattered glass. In the ashes, Harlan's badge glittered half-melted, fused to a mason jar shard. Calla pried it loose. The label stub read, Blackridge Sacrament, 1927. She buried it where the chimney fell. 3 days later, spring rains flooded the valley. Fishermen swore they saw shapes in the creek's foam antler shadows, a woman's laugh bubbling from the deep holes. But when the trappers come asking, Calla serves them sweet tea and silence. On the ridge, new hickories sprout where the still house stood. Their bark grows in coiled patterns. Like nooses. The gallows draft. Blackstock Manor's grand ballroom had been decaying for a century, but tonight it gleamed. Candles spat light across tarnished sconces. Their flames doubled in the milky eyes of moth-eaten stag heads mounted on the walls. The distillery's event planner had draped everything in fishnet and sailor's rope, the decor caught between maritime kitsch and funeral shroud. Guests sipped rum from glasses stamped with the distillery's new logo, a noose dangling above frothing waves, while a string quartet scraped out a minor key rendition of Drunken Sailor. Salt air slithered through cracks in the foundation, though the sea hadn't touched this bluff since the harbor silted over in 1842. Elise Covington arrived fashionably late and absurdly mortal. She'd built a following live streaming herself sneaking into cemeteries, her designer purse forever stocked with EMF meters and a travel-sized seance kit. The distillery's publicist had handed her the first pour of their resurrected historic blend, and Elise now held it aloft on the makeshift stage, her sequined dress swallowing the candlelight. "Let's make this trend dead viral," she crowed, winking at her phone propped on the lectern. 200 bored blue bloods raised their glasses. No one noticed the liquid inside quiver, as if something beneath the floorboards had exhaled. The rum tasted like congealed honey cut with vinegar. Elise swallowed it with an exaggerated shudder. "Tastes like my third marriage." The crowd's laughter curdled when her throat clicked audibly, a wet sound, like a crab scuttling over rocks. She grinned, clutching her suddenly bloated stomach. "No, seriously, is this anaphylaxis?" The chandelier began to sway. Or maybe it was Elise. Her left hand spasmed, her manicured nails clawing at the air as if grasping for rigging. She rasped out the opening lines of Bound for South Australia, the old whaler's shanty her great-great-grandfather had allegedly sung before his schooner sank with all hands. None of the guests recognized it. Not until later. A guest in the front row screamed when Elise's pupils burst like overfilled blisters, leaching black brine down her cheeks. Her knees buckled, but her arms stayed locked upward, the empty glass still clenched. The quartet faltered, cello groaning as the violinist backed into a lifeboat-shaped punch bowl. "She's choking," someone shouted, though the liquid gushing from Elise's nostrils wasn't vomit. It smelled of kelp and ship rot. Her ribs crackled like driftwood. Her skin split, unleashing a flood of seawater that sluiced across the floorboards, foaming around guests' ankles. A man in a captain's costume slipped and cracked his skull on the hearth. Elise's corpse remained grotesquely upright, rigor mortis freezing her in that mock toast, even as two fishermen's sons from the volunteer FD heaved her onto a stretcher. The medical examiner found her stomach packed with knotted grave moss and 24 human molars, all pre-1800s. The molasses coating them wasn't modern, no preservatives, no additives. Just raw, fermented sugar, same as what lined the barrels in town records from Blackstock's 1734 trial. By dawn, the mayor had threatened lawsuits. The distillery's COO blamed an allergic reaction to tradition. The town's oldest lobsterman spat on the cobblestones outside the manor and muttered about Mercy's End still hungry. Cleanup crews scrubbed the salt stains for days. The stank lingered. The Coast Guard investigator assigned to the case found Elise's phone still recording in the wreckage. The video's last frames showed a shadow rippling across the wall behind her, a silhouette too tall, too jointless, crowned with something jagged. Antlers, maybe. Or coral. 43 guests took home complimentary bottles of the rum. They'd all be dead by high tide. Wood smoke and brine clung to the distillery warehouse long after the firefighters declared the blaze non-suspicious. Only the brick shell remained, its iron beams twisted like saltwater taffy. Silas Harlow, the founder's grandson, had been found in the main fermentation room, swaying gently from a rafter. Not unusual for a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of drinking alone. What troubled the coroner was the foot-long tarnished silver horn rammed down his throat, its tip poking grotesquely through his left rib cage. The engravings were still legible beneath the blood tar. M. Blackstock, Reaper of Tides. The Coast Guard investigator, Kellen Merrow, recognized the horn's design. She'd seen sketches in her grandfather's journal's former keeper of the Portsgrave Light, a man who'd vanished during a storm in '92, leaving behind only a waterlogged chair and a half-empty bottle labeled Mermaid's Malice. Kellen had inherited his tremor for tides. Now, staring at Harlow's waxy face, she wondered if his death would follow her to sleep too. The night watchman swore he'd heard singing before the fire started. "Not a shanty," he croaked, picking blackened rum sludge from his beard. "Hymnal. Slow. Wrong." The distillery's security cameras showed nothing but static after 2:17 a.m., though audio playback revealed a wet, rhythmic thumping. Later, Kellen realized it matched the cadence of waves against a ship's hull. Nobody mentioned the teeth. They'd scattered when the firefighters cut Harlow down, bouncing across the ash like ivory dice. Molars, incisors, all stained with something darker than rum residue. The coroner kept finding them for weeks in his shoe, his lunchbox, his wife's chiffonier. He'd retire by Chapter 4, muttering about salt cysts under his tongue. Kellen found a ledger in Harlow's office safe. Not financial records, but handwritten entries dated 1983 to 1986, detailing expeditions to a nameless atoll off Montauk. Dived 12 fathoms. Coral growth on keel matches Mercy's End wreckage ledgers. Recovered cask number 7. Must dissolve bone meal before full moon. A Polaroid showed Harlow standing knee-deep in a tide pool, holding a barnacled horn identical to the one that killed him. The seawater around him swirled counterclockwise. The town archivist, Linnea Voss, arrived uninvited that afternoon. She wore a moth-eaten peacoat and an expression Kellen recognized the feverish glint of someone who'd spent too long squinting at dead people's handwriting. "Blackstock didn't just make rum," Linnea said, crouching to examine Harlow's cracked leather shoes. "She brewed reckonings. Served them in that horn to the men who signed her death warrant. Drowned in their own beds by morning. Judge Rent's wife said his corpse vomited eels." Harlow's funeral drew more gawkers than mourners. The horn was confiscated as evidence, boxed in a steel locker at the Portsgrave precinct. The officer tasked with guarding it developed trench foot in under 6 hours. At midnight, Kellen stood in the evidence room, the horn inches from her latex-gloved hand. Its surface felt colder than the ocean floor. When Linnea's call came, the teeth are victims' molars, pre-1900s, some still with gold fillings. Kellen's grip slipped. A single drop of black rum oozed from the horn's mouthpiece. It hit the floor with a sound like a diver surfacing. The next morning, all 43 gala guests who took home bottles of Blackstock's Revival were found dead, rigid in their beds, gilt-edged glasses in hand, salt water weeping from their ears. Kellen found Harlow's dive team logs hidden behind a false wall in the warehouse. The last entry, dated 2 days before his death, read, "It's singing to the horn again. Can't tell if it's Mercy's End or her. Maybe she's finally making the trade." She nearly missed the footnote at the bottom of the page, a crude sketch of 9 tankards arranged in a circle. The words "thirsty congregation" smudged beneath. When Kellen returned to the evidence locker, the horn was gone. In its place, a puddle of brine and a single barnacle, still breathing. The coordinates from the business card glowed on Kellen's laptop, a pinprick of Malice in the mid-Atlantic. Linnea had overlaid it with a 1734 nautical chart, the Mercy's End's route scribbled in fading ink. "Blackstock's ship sank here," she said, jabbing a fingernail at the screen. But the manifests list no cargo, just 9 offerings. She didn't mention the wet footprints she'd found that morning leading to her door, salt-crusted and webbed. The dive shop owner refused to rent them equipment. "Ain't no one goes down there since '92, he said, eyeing Kellen's badge like it was a hex. "My uncle chartered a crew to loot the wreck. Came back with a trunk full of silverware and mouths full of tongues. He spat into a rusted spittoon. Swollen ones. Still wriggling. They took Linnea's late father's boat, a rotting dinghy named Betsy's Revenge. The engine coughed black smoke as they crested waves sharp as bone shards." Kellen clutched the barnacle-scarred rail, her grandfather's stories of the drowned fast thrumming in her veins. "A feast for what can't be filled," he'd warned. "The sea's always starving." Linnea donned antique diving gear looted from the Historical Society's basement. The brass helmet made her look like a Victorian ghost. "If the horn's part of the 9 offerings," she radioed, her voice tinny through the corroded mic, "there's 8 more relics down there. Maybe they're the toasts." Kellen didn't ask what happened when all 9 were raised. The water was colder than grief. Linnea's flashlight carved through the gloom, revealing jagged spines of coral that pulsed faintly, as if breathing. The Mercy's End's hull loomed ahead, its ribs warped into a cathedral of rot. A figure drifted in the wreck's shadows, too elongated, too still. Linnea told herself it was a seal. Inside the captain's quarters, a ledger lay open on a silt-covered desk. Linnea's numb fingers turned the pages. Sketches of 9 vessels, horn, goblet, chalice, each labeled with a date. 1687, 1701, 1734. The last entry, Mercy's End silver horn, bore a marginal note: "The congregation thirsts. Offerings must be made in the blood-tide hour." A handprint stained the paper, its brine still damp after 3 centuries. Something brushed Linnea's ankle. She spun, flashlight trembling. A child's porcelain doll grinned up at her, seaweed hair writhing. Its chest cavity held a coiled hagfish, milky eyes rolling. Linnea recoiled, kicking up silt. When it settled, the doll was gone. Kellen hauled her back to the surface, swearing when she saw the ledger. "This isn't evidence, it's a goddamn curse." Linnea peeled off her gloves, fingertips pruned and stinking of low tide. Blackstock wasn't paying tribute to the sea. She was feeding it, binding it. The engine died 3 nautical miles from shore. As Kellen wrestled the spark plugs, Linnea stared into the deep. Shadows coiled beneath the boat, too vast for fish. A low vibration hummed through the hull, a sound like a throat gargling stones. They drifted until moonrise. Kellen finally revived the engine, but the radio spat only static and a wet, rhythmic clicking. Linnea transcribed it. SOS. Over and over. Back at port, the dockmaster greeted them with a shotgun. "Town's gone mad," he growled. The streets reeked of rotting shellfish. Storefronts were boarded up, save the distillery. Its neon sign buzzed a feverish green. Through the shattered windows, figures swayed in unison, their shadows grotesquely stretched. Kellen counted 9. The next victim hung from the port's grave light, kelp braided into a noose. Their face was nibbled clean, but the feet were pristine size 6 sneakers, pink laces. The missing volunteer from the morgue. A silver chalice jutted from her ribs, engraved for the thirsting congregation. Kellen didn't need Linnea to tally the math. 7 toasts drunk. Now 8. In the chalice's belly. A slurry of rum, blood, and a Polaroid of Linnea and Kellen boarding Betsy's Revenge. "It's choosing the offerings," Linnea whispered. Her pockets sagged with teeth. Portsgrave's Tavern had been dry since Prohibition, but tonight its oak bar groaned under Blackstock Revival bottles. Townsfolk hunched over glasses, their movements synchronized like cogs in a rusted machine. Old Ned Coulter, who'd never touched a drop in his 70 years, slurped rum straight from the neck, his dentures floating in a salt-rimmed bowl. "Tastes like before," he crooned, black drool staining his overalls. Like her. Kellen watched from the alley, her breath fogging the cracked window. Beside her, Linnea adjusted a stolen police radio, its chatter reduced to guttural moans and the clink of glass. "They're not drinking it," Linnea muttered. "They're communing." The tavern's jukebox crackled to life without being plugged in. A dirge slithered from its speakers, a warped rendition of the Mermaid's Ballad, strings replaced by the creak of straining hulls. Patrons began to sway, their joints popping as they contorted into shapes that defied bone. Ned's spine arched backward, his head brushing his heels, as he poured rum into his own gaping mouth. They retreated to the archives. Linnea had pinned a new map over the autopsy photos. Portsgrave's salt marsh, its tidal creeks branching like veins. Red X's marked where bodies had washed ashore since the Horn's disappearance. Kellen traced the pattern. It's a spiral, ending at the old lightkeeper's cottage. Linnea stiffened. Your grandfather's station. The air thickened. Kellen's scarred collarbone burned as she unholstered her sidearm, barrel hovering over the cottage's coordinates. She hadn't stepped foot there since age 9, when they'd pulled her from the riptide. Granddad's final words haunted her. "You'll owe the tide a debt now. It always collects." Midnight found them wading through the marsh, reeds slashing their shins. The cottage hunched ahead, its windows shattered, but the lightkeeper's logbook lay pristine on the kitchen table. Kellen's flashlight trembled as she flipped to the final entry, her grandfather's handwriting, dated the night he vanished. "Mercy's End calls again. Found another relic today wedged in the rocks, same silver as the Horn but shaped like a bell. Rang it once. Mist rolled in faster than any fog. Saw her walking the breakers, skirt sodden, hair full of crabs. She smiled. I think she's been waiting for kin to finish the trade." Kellen's throat tightened. Linnea pried the logbook from her grip. "He knew you'd come back. Knew you'd..." A shriek cut her off. Ned Coulter lurched from the marsh, his torso distended, skin split around a protruding silver bell. Its clapper was a human femur. "To the thirsting," he howled, salt water geysering from his nostrils. Kellen fired. The bullet punched through the bell, unleashing a sonorous dong that shook the ground. Ned collapsed, his body deflating like a punctured buoy. The marsh erupted. Dozens surged from the reeds, townsfolk bloated with seawater, silver relics bursting from their flesh. A chalice sprouted from the postmaster's sternum, a flagon from the librarian's eye socket. Their chant rattled Kellen's molars. 9 toasts, 9 tides, 9 wakes for the drown-fast bride. Linnea yanked Kellen into the cottage, barricading the door with a salt-crusted armoire. Shadows writhed beyond the windows, clawing at the glass with barnacled fingers. "The relics are in them," Linnea panted. "They're using the town to finish the congregation." Kellen's phone buzzed a text from the evidence clerk. A photo of the barnacle shell, its interior now split open like a locket. Inside, a scrap of vellum with coordinates matching the lighthouse. The caption read, "You're the 9th toast." The radio in Linnea's bag crackled. A voice both familiar and alien, layered with the hiss of tides, poured from the speaker. "Kinslayer's due is overdue." Kellen's grandfather's voice. "Bring the air. Bring the hornless song. The drown-fast thirsts." Linnea gripped Kellen's wrist. "He's not gone. He's with her." They fled through a root cellar choked with jellyfish, their bioluminescence painting the walls corpse blue. The tunnel emptied into a sea cave, its ceiling strung with shark vertebrae and sailors' knots. At its heart stood a stone altar, 9 slots carved into its surface. 8 gleamed with relics: the horn, bell, chalice. The 9th gaped empty. Linnea's flashlight died. In the dark, wet laughter echoed, the sea cave's walls dripped with a substance too thick for water, its stench a blend of open graves and fermented rum. Kellen pressed her back against the altar, her sidearm trained on the laughter's source. Linnea fumbled with a lighter, the flame catching on a kelp strand that ignited like a fuse. The sudden blaze revealed Maylease Blackstock seated atop a coral throne, her skeletal fingers tapping a femur rhythmically against a human ribcage xylophone. Her dress swam with luminescent algae, and her eye sockets housed twin urchins, their spines clicking in Morse code. "Come home, granddaughter," Blackstock rasped, though her jawbone remained fused. The voice emerged from the walls themselves. "You've kept the drown fast waiting." She gestured to Kellen's collarbone scar with a barnacle-crusted hand. "Your blood signed the ledger long before you spat at the tide's gift." Kellen's finger tightened on the trigger. Linnea clutched the lighter like a talisman. "The 9th relic isn't silver. It's her," she hissed. "You're the final toast." Blackstock's laughter sent crabs scuttling from her ribcage. "Foolish scribe. The 9th vessel is choice." She rose, her form elongating into something part squid, part storm. "Your grandfather chose servitude over sacrifice. He broke the congregation's chain. Now the sea gnaws its chains." The ground shuddered. Seawater geysered through cracks in the altar, swirling into a vortex above the 9th slot. Within its spiral, Kellen glimpsed her grandfather's face stretched across the foam. His mouth moved in tandem with Blackstock's. "Bind the offering, Kell, or the tide takes all." Linnea lunged for the altar, snatching Blackstock's horn from its slot. "What burns salt?" she screamed, dunking the relic into the vortex. The water hissed, recoiling. Blackstock howled an air horn blast of discordant whale song. Kellen's mind fractured. 9 years old again, the riptide's fingers in her hair. Her grandfather's hand yanking her back. His whisper as she coughed up brine. "You're marked now." But marks can be bargaining chips. The vortex convulsed. Silver relics flew from the altar, embedding into Kellen's flesh chalice in her palm, flagon in her thigh, bell in her jaw. Blood and seawater spiraled down her limbs, weaving into a coral exoskeleton. Blackstock's form blurred, her voice splintering. "You are Harlow's debt inherited. Choose, Portsgrave's flesh or the sea's feast." Linnea tackled Kellen as the cave ceiling collapsed. "Choose neither," she roared, jamming the horn into the 9th slot. A shockwave of brine and static threw them against the wall. The relics dislodged, reassembling midair into a scale model of the Mercy's end. It hovered, dripping, cannon ports glowing. Blackstock's skeleton crumbled. "The congregation toasts without me," she sighed, her skull dissolving into sea foam. "Mind the guests, dear child. They're ever so punctual." The vortex exploded. Salt water hammered them into unconsciousness. Kellen woke on the beach beneath Portsgrave light, Linnea vomiting seawater beside her. Dawn bled across the horizon, staining the waves rust red. The town was silent, no groans, no clicking radios. Just the shriek of gulls circling the docks. The distillery's neon sign lay shattered on the boardwalk. Amid the glass shards, 9 silver relics gleamed, arranged in a perfect circle. At its center, a human heart petrified in salt, its arteries threaded with kelp. Linnea prodded it with a stick. Blackstock's final toast? Kellen touched her collarbone. The scar had transformed into an intricate tattoo, a ship's wheel fused with a noose. Her grandfather's voice, faint now, echoed, "Paid in full." For now. They burned the relics in the Historical Society's furnace. Each screamed as it melted. The smoke formed a woman's face, lips parted in a silent hymn, before dissipating. That night, the tide retreated farther than any record showed. Exposed seabed stretched for miles, littered with shipwrecks and a massive obsidian archway crusted in oysters. Linnea stood at the water's edge, Kellen's scar reflected in her glasses. "You closed the door," she said. "But doors swing both ways." Kellen tossed the heart into the surf. It sank slowly, trailing tendrils of black blood. Let it chew on that for a century. In the archives, the Mercy's End's ledger now ends with a new entry, penned in brine-smudged ink, "Debt settled. Drown fast sleeps." Let the liars drink deep. The first tourists arrive next week. They'll ask about the lighthouse, the distillery ruins. Kellen will say nothing. Linnea will sell them vials of cursed sea glass from her gift shop. Far below, where the trench kisses the underworld's cheek, something clinks silver against stone. Patiently, hungrily, the Agave Psalm. The desert held the heat like a grudge long after sundown. Outside the boutique Mescaleria's adobe walls, the Sonoran night pulsed with cicada screams and the rasp of wind through dry-throated cacti. Inside, chandeliers carved from salvaged railroad glass dangled above a crowd of influencers, smugglers in tailored linen, and one retired narco-corrido singer sweating through his leather jacket. They'd all come for La Lagrima Negra, the Mescaleria's launch tonic, smoky, velvety, and distilled from blue agave hearts roasted in a pit lined with volcanic rock and something the bartenders only called ceniza bendita. Blessed ash. Valentina de la Rosa, a wellness guru with 2.3 million followers, had already posted 3 thirst traps with the clay capitas. Her caption, when sacrament meets sin, blackheart hashtag La Lagrima Negra hashtag sip the shadow, lit up like a votive candle in the algorithm's gloom. Javier, the Mescaleria's gaunt owner, watched her from behind the bar. His fingers traced the crucifix tattooed onto his throat as she raised her 4th glass. To the desert, she purred, her voice a lick-a-slick hum. It withers everything. But us. The crowd echoed her salute, and the garnet liquid shimmered under their phones' upraised halos. What happened next played well on TikTok. Valentina's throat convulsed mid-swallow. Her head snapped back as if yanked by wire, vertebrae crackling like kindling, spine bending into an impossible curve, a drawn bow, a crescent moon. Phone flashes froze her jaw unhinged, eyes rolled white, fingers clawing at the empty air as if grasping for a chalice only she could see. She collapsed backward onto the bar, skull cracking the clay pitcher. Its contents thick, resinous mezcal the color of charred honey dribbled into her mouth, her nostrils, the gasping O of her lips. The guests screamed. The singer fainted. Javier dipped 2 fingers into the spillage and brought them to his own mouth, whispering, "No era para ti, hermana. Not for you, sister." By dawn, the coroner found Valentina's bones strung with fibrous tendrils, agave vascular tissue. He'd right webbing her ribs into a lattice like the veins of a roasted maguey heart. Her jugulars held not blood, but a viscous smoke that pooled in the autopsy tray and refused to dissolve, even under bleach. One intern swore it whispered in Nahuatl. The Mescaleria closed for a private reflection. Javier left bouquets of bitter orange blossoms at the entrance, their petals curling black at the edges. The remaining bottles of La Lagrima Negra developed a sediment the color of burnt church frescoes. When shaken, the sludge swirled into shapes, a nun's wimple, a rope noose, a snake swallowing its own tail. Out in the desert, coyotes began avoiding the distillery's perimeter. They peeled away from its scent, not fear, but recognition. The same stench had festered in the soil here centuries before. Sacramental wine turned profane, penitents' muffled psalms, a nun's curse simmering under the earth. Back in Phoenix, the DEA initially dismissed it as fentanyl cut with bathtub mescaline. Then the toxicology report came back. Valentina's bloodstream contained no drugs, just fermented agave sugars, volcanic silica, and a peptide chain matching no known species of protein, the lab tech said, structured like a prayer. By midnight, someone leaked the autopsy photos. Valentina's contorted posture trended as #ExorcistChallenge. Teenagers in Tempe and Tucson staged mock seizures, backs arched, fingers hooked into phantom goblets. 3 collapsed. 1 bit through her tongue. Javier burned Palo Santo in the distillery's courtyard. The smoke curled into the silhouette of a woman, her hands clasped as if in prayer or throttling an unseen neck. He murmured the only words left, "Ella Viena. She's coming." The news vans left by week's end. Arizona forgot. But in the Mescaleria cellar, the fermentation vats bubbled louder. And out in the dunes, the agave plants began to bleed. Doctor. Nelly Xochitl kept the Inquisition scroll in a temperature-controlled sleeve, but it still reeked of guilt. The Archivo General de la Nación had classified it as fraude colonial, a heretic's ravings, but the parchment prickled her palms like sunburn. She'd handled codices flayed from Aztec priests, confessionals penned in conquistador blood, but this itched. The vellum wasn't sheepskin. Too supple. Too human. The scroll detailed the trial of Sister Marisol de la Cruz, a Carmelite mystic shipped to Nueva España in 1689. Accused of communing with pestilent spirits, she'd turned her convent's wine cellar into a distillery. Not for sacraments. For something else. Witnesses described her bottling night dew, collected from the eyelids of plague victims, fermenting it with ashes from auto-da-fe pyres. The Inquisitor's notes hissed with fury. She claimed the true vine was not Christ, but the serpent's blood in Eden's soil. Nelly's hands shook as she unrolled the brittle page. The ink iron gall mixed with a streaky brown she didn't want to name depicted Marisol's symbol, a cactus crucified on a T-shaped rack, thorns piercing its flesh like stigmata, identical to the sigil stamped onto the La Lagrima Negra bottles. The University of Sonora had called her in as a consultant after Valentina's autopsy. Cultural context, they'd said. They didn't mention the mezcal. The convent's location matched the GPS coordinates of Javier's distillery. Nelly cross-referenced colonial land grants with aerial surveys. Satellite imagery showed a faint circular scar in the soil too precise for a natural sinkhole. A foundation. A horno, maybe, where the nuns burned their bread, or their sisters. Marisol's final confession, scrawled in delirious loops, the hearth hungers not for wood, but for drinkers. Offer them, and the fire purifies. Deny it, and the embers linger. Nelly traced the last word. The parchment blistered under her fingertip. That night, the DEA agent arrived, Carlos Varela, reeking of nicotine and cynicism. He slapped Valentina's crime scene photos on Nelly's desk. Her honeycombed bones, the autopsy tray's smoky sludge. Your dean says you know witchcraft. His smirk faltered when Nelly slid the scroll toward him. 1693. Sister Marisol was burned. But her ashes weren't scattered. They were brewed. Carlos snorted. So a dead nun's running a cartel? He paused, eyeing the crucified cactus drawing. Wait. These marks on the victim's bottles. You've seen it before. Nelly didn't answer. She opened her laptop, pulling up a 1701 missionary's diary entry. After Marisol's execution, 10 soldiers toasted her martyrdom with confiscated casks of her elixir. By dawn, they'd liquefied *. Their uniforms lay in puddles, skin sloughed off like grape pulp. The priest wrote that their screams * steamed. The agent's phone buzzed. Another victim, a TikToker in Nogales, mid-unboxing video of La Lagrima Negra. She'd toasted the camera, collapsed, spine arcing as her ribs split into fibrous white fans. Agave metamorphosis, Nelly muttered. Marisol didn't curse the drink. She cursed the act of drinking. Carlos lit a cigarette, ignoring the NO smoking sign. The distillery's owner, Javier. He left this in Valentina's dressing room. He tossed a velvet pouch onto the scroll. Inside, 9 brittle fingernails, yellowed and curved like talons. DNA matches a 17th century crypt beneath the distillery. Care to guess whose? Nelly's throat tightened. Marisol's. Bingo! And here's the kicker, he flicked ash onto her notes. Javier's not on any census, deed, or payroll. It's like he materialized when the mescaleria broke ground. Nelly stayed late, the scroll's hum deepening. At 3 a.m., she noticed it. Marisol's crucified cactus, inked at the margin, now bore fruit. Tiny crimson bulbs swelled on the page. When she pressed a thumb to one, it burst. The stain smelled of anise and burned hair. As she left, the night janitor stopped her. Senora Doctora, you're back. He pointed a shaking mop at the wall. Her shadow, cast by fluorescent lights, didn't match her posture. It curved like a bow, hands raised. Clutching nothing, the distillery exhaled. Carlos felt it as soon as they breached the doors, a hot, wet breath reeking of burnt sugar and copper. The raid team lingered in the courtyard, uneasy. They'd all seen the Narcos memes about cartel-cursed ware, but this wasn't Sinaloa. This was older. The adobe walls bled a sticky resin that fluoresced under UV flashlights, glowing like swamp algae. Like the shit inside Valentina, one agent muttered, swearing the ooze rippled away from his boots. Javier wasn't there. His office held only a ledger filled with symbols mimicking Nahuatl numerals, except the counts didn't add up. Each row tallied bottles sold, but the sums bled into dates: 1693, 1701, 1810. Years of massacres, plagues, droughts. Nellie ran a finger down the page. He's not tracking inventory. He's tracking offerings. They found the vats in the cellar. 10 massive troughs of Spanish cedar, their staves bound with rusted iron hoops. Carlos pried one open. The stench hit him, first cloying sweetness undercut by pork fat rot. The liquid inside swirled slow and syrupy, amber streaked with veins of algae green. But it was the lining that made Nellie gag. Charred human ribs arched like barrel staves, fused to the wood. Femurs braced the base. A pelvis, blackened and brittle, formed the spigot. Sacred geometry, Nellie whispered, bile sharp in her throat. Marisol built her first stills from martyr bones. The Inquisition burned heretics, so she recycled. Lab results came back at dusk. The mezcal contained high levels of oleuropein, a compound found in olive leaves, toxic to humans. But the tox screen also flagged something labeled Zohutl in the footnotes. Nellie scoured her codices. Zohutl, Nahuatl for soul sickness, a feverish wasting believed to be caused by drinking the shadow of a sacrificial victim. They didn't ferment agave, she told Carlos, voice frayed. They fermented people. Feverish ones. The sicker the body, the sweeter the spirit. Carlos ordered the vats drained. The agents hauled hoses, but the liquid refused to pump. Thick as tar, it clung to the tanks like mucus. One rookie reached in with a ladle. The mezcal coiled around his wrist, yanking him chest deep before Carlos grabbed his belt. They severed the ladle's handle. The rookie's arm emerged unscathed, but reeking of clove and necrotic tissue. "It's alive," he panted. "It hates us." Nellie studied the liquid under a field microscope. The droplets twitched. Magnified, they resolved into microscopic agave fibers, each barbed with silica needles. They're not just fermenting. They're seeding. She remembered Valentina's bones, webbed with plant tissue. The mezcal isn't a product. It's a vector. Then the screams started. Upstairs, agents had found Javier's aging room. Rows of corked bottles sat on shelves, their labels handwritten in 17th century script. But the corner, a brick hearth, dominated the wall, its mantel carved with a frieze of figures toasting goblets to their own melting faces. Inside the hearth, a mound of ash, still warm. Buried within it, a skeletal hand clutched a clay jug. The coroner would later determine the bones were modern. Female. Missing since 2019. The jug held a viscous black paste that tested as 90% ethanol and 10% keratin, human hair dissolved in alcohol. "An altar," Nellie said. Carlos kicked the ash. Embers winked red beneath, though no fire burned. "The blackened hearth," Nellie added. "A Tetzahuitl. An omen god." Marisol didn't just summon it. She merged it with Catholic hellfire. They torched the vats. The flames roared blue-green, howling with a sound like glass shattering underwater. Nellie pocketed a bone fragment from the cedar staves. Later, under her desk lamp, she'd realize it wasn't human. Too curved, too hollow. A bishop's crozier, maybe. or a rib from something that never knelt. Back at headquarters, Carlos tried to debrief. His superior cut him off. "You destroyed a licensed business over folktales," until a tech interrupted. Security footage from the raid. The camera above the cellar door had captured something. Shadows pooling like oil, then rising into stick figure shapes. One by one, they raised their arms. Toasting. At 3 a.m., Carlos found Nellie at the university lab. She'd isolated a protein from the ash, a chain of amino acids that formed a helix matching no known DNA. On screen, it rotated, glowing faintly. "It's a hymn," she said. A liturgical chant translated into biochemistry. "If we reverse the sequence," she clicked a key. The helix unwound. The speakers blasted a cacophony of wailing Nahuatl choir boys and a woman's guttural Latin. Carlos vomited in the trash can. Nellie didn't blame him. The song wasn't just heard. It squirmed. The first time Nellie bled agave sap, she blamed the stress. A paper cut on her thumb wept golden resin instead of blood. By dawn, her veins itched as if barbed quills were migrating toward her heart. She hid it from Carlos, scrubbing her hands raw after the lab's new intern, bright-eyed Mateo, who'd volunteered to analyze the helix's lyrics, collapsed during a spectrometry run. His retinas had clouded milky white, pupils splitting into dual black slits like agave spines. He whispered, "She says you're almost ready," before biting through his tongue. Carlos found the suicide note in Mateo's locker. A single sentence scribbled in 16th century Castilian. "No he pecado en la sed, solo en la negation." There is no sin in thirst, only in denial. Beneath it, a crudely drawn blackened hearth, flames licking a chalice full of eyes. The mescaleria's ashes had spread. News reports trickled in. A pop-up bar in Cabo San Lucas serving limited edition La Lagrima Negra, a Yucatan resort infecting an entire bachelorette party. Victims now died connected. Autopsy photos revealed their rib cages fused by agave fibers into a single lattice, as though their bodies were branches grafted to an unseen tree. Social media called it #SkeletonVine. Teenagers hashtagged their DNR orders. Javier resurfaced in Nogales, tending bar at a roadside taqueria. Carlos' team moved in at dusk. He was gone, but the scent lingered, not cologne, but burnt sacrament. Behind the counter, they found a clay urn brimming with a liquid that glowed like phosphorus. Nellie dipped a slide into it. Under the microscope, the droplets danced, arranging themselves into Marisol's crucified cactus. Carlos' phone buzzed with an encrypted video. Grainy footage, a colonial church lit by torchlight. A woman, face hooded, strapped to a pyre. The flames didn't burn her. They bowed. She raised her arms, shackles melting like wax, and drank the smoke from her own execution. The camera panned to bystanders clutching their throats, their skin splitting into white fibrous strips. The timestamp read 1693. The sender's ID at La Hoguera Eterna. The Eternal Pyre. Nellie traced the video's metadata to a server in Guatemala City. It didn't exist. But her screen stayed fever-hot for hours, and that night, she dreamed in Nahuatl syllables that peeled her tongue like blisters. They tracked Javier to a decaying hacienda outside Hermosillo. The walls were papered with colonial land deeds and faded retablos depicting Marisol as a saint, her hands full of flames and agave. In the courtyard, a stone well exhaled a vinegary mist. Carlos dropped a flare. The light plunged 50 feet, glinting off submerged bottles of La Lagrima Negra and a pale, floating shape. Too large for a body. Too knotted. Nellie refused to look. This isn't a crime scene. It's a lungs. She pressed her palm to the hacienda's outer wall. The stucco pulsed. He's feeding the roots. This house, Marisol's convent, it's alive. They missed Javier by minutes. His ledger lay open on a table, fresh ink glistening. This time, the columns listed names, not numbers. Valentina. Mateo. Father Ignacio, a priest who'd blessed the raid team. Dates crossed out. Replacements scribbled beside them. Nellie's breath hitched at the last entry, her own name, slashed through with a charcoal line. Below it, Carlos Varela. The lab called as they sped back. The HIMS proteins, injected into lab mice, had dissolved their skeletons into a gelatinous pith, but their eyes remained intact. And when placed near audio of Marisol's chant, the eyes rolled, pupils dilating into voids that leaked the same black ethanol keratin sludge. "They're cameras," the tech said. "She's watching." Carlos pulled over, vomiting onto the highway shoulder. Nellie didn't notice. Her cut had reopened. The sap now flowed darker, flecked with black spores. She pressed a tissue to it. The spores sprouted, tendrils looping her wrist like a rosary. She yanked them off. They left hairline burns in the shape of a nun's wimple. They arrived at her apartment to find the door ajar. Inside, Javier stood at her desk, sipping from a flask. His crucifix tattoo wept fresh ink. "You opened the scroll, Doctora. You invited." He gestured to her research photos of Marisol's bones, the HIMS protein helix, a vial of Valentina's ash. "She wants collaborators, not sacrifices. You're too late to beg, but just in time to brew." Nellie lunged for her revolver. Carlos drew faster. 3 bullets tore through Javier's chest. He smiled as he collapsed, blood pooling thick as molasses. Then he dissolved, flesh sloughing into a swarm of agave beetles that scattered into the air vents. On the floor, his flask rolled to Nellie's feet. The liquid inside mirrored the helix's structure. Glowing. Hungry. Her phone lit up with a Google alert. #Exorcist Challenge had resurged. New video from Monterey. 100 teens contorted in unison, spines arched, mouths distended. Their collective screams sounded like a match striking. They burned Nellie's apartment complex to the ground. Carlos called it in as a gas leak, but the flames refused to consume room 304. Firefighters found her desk intact, research papers pristine, the vial of Valentina's ash replaced by a cluster of agave flowers blooming through her keyboard. Their nectar drew swarms of thalacipolotl pre-Hispanic moths thought extinct, their wings veined like capillary patterns. They left powdery trails on the walls that spelled Zoxaha in Nahuatl glyphs. The soil remembers. Nellie fled to her grandmother's ranch in Tetlapachco, a corpse of a town where the church bells still rang for the 1736 plague. Abuela's cure was brutal. Temazcal sweat lodge, peyote slivers under the tongue, a poultice of corpse flour and bullet ants. "You carry a ghost, Mija asterisk, she rasped, scraping Nellie's infected arm with an obsidian blade. The sap that oozed out solidified into amber beads. Each held a suspended silhouette. Marisol, Javier, 100 half-formed faces drinking from hollowed skulls. "She's not a ghost. She's a habit." Carlos intercepted a shipping container at the Guaymas port. Customs dismissed it as organic compost, but the crates held glass demijohns of La Lagrima Negra, each sloshing with a gelatinous mass that pressed finger-shaped protrusions against the glass. The manifest listed the buyer as Cielito Lindo Tecaleros, but the contact email bounced back from a server registered to the Archbishopric of Mexico in 1702. The crew chief confessed through blistered lips. Javier paid in old silver coins. They sweated. Nellie's dreams sharpened. Marisol walked her through the distillery cellar, pointing to vats that breathed like lungs. "You misunderstand our work, Doctora Star, Tucatlan the divine drunkard does not punish, he liberates. Drink deeply, and the flesh becomes spirit." She pressed a goblet to Nellie's lips. The liquid was cold, alive, singing in polyphonic Nahuatl. Nellie woke with a molar loose on her pillow. Its roots had split into fibrous agave threads. Carlos arrived at the ranch with a stolen DEA file. 1987. A failed FBI raid on a Sonoran cult fermenting ascension serum from Huitzilopochtli temple excavation soil. Survivors described a nun-shaped shadow melting agents into a syrupy cordial. The file's photos were redacted, but Carlos had scrawled in the margin, "They're using us. Every raid, every news story, it markets the curse. We're her fucking distributors." Abuela led them to the town's abandoned cemetery. Moonlight pooled in the grave of Sor Ines, a nun who'd vanished in 1693. The soil was hot. No fermenting. They dug. The coffin held no bones, just a corked bottle and a spindle wrapped with human hair. Nelly uncorked it. The scent was unmistakable, La Lagrima Negra. But when Carlos reached for it, she dumped it onto the grave. The soil hissed, birthing a white agave stalk that unfurled into a skeletal hand. It pointed west. Javier found them at dawn, or what was left of him. His torso was a hive of agave beetles, his face a nest of rootlets sprouting from empty sockets. "She prefers you conscious, Doctora Star." Asterisk, his voice buzzed. "The hymn in your blood needs context." He tossed a scroll older than the first, its vellum stitched from tattooed skin. Marisol's final sermon. The first miracle was not water to wine. It was God's tears after Eden's fall. Drink them, and the gates dissolve. They raced to the Tequila volcano, where the scroll's map marked an Oquetzalcoatl, a hidden cellar. The entrance was a crack oozing black resin, its edges carved with drunkard gods cradling broken spines. Inside, the walls throbbed. Centuries of offerings moldered, musket balls, drug bricks, iPhone cases. At the chamber's heart stood a stone still, its basin etched with the same crucified cactus. Above it hung a thorn chandelier, human ribs strung with glass votives holding liquid shadows. Carlos aimed his gun at the still. Nelly stopped him. "It's a heart, idiota Star. Shatter it, and the infection metastasizes." Asterisk, she pressed her palm to the basin. The stone peeled back, revealing a pulpy core. Marisol's final distillation. Not mezcal. A vein to the hearth. "We have to poison it." Abuela unwrapped the cemetery spindle. "Mix my thread with her song." The hair wasn't Sor Ines, it was Marisol's, sheared before her pyre. Nelly fed it into the basin while Carlos poured Valentina's ash. The still groaned. The chamber shook. Black liquid surged, screaming as the hair and ash entwined, forming a clump of snarled shadows that sank like a stone. The chandelier dimmed. Javier's beetles rained dead. For a breath, it worked. Then the basin spat. The liquid hit Nelly's chest, searing through her shirt. Beneath the burn, her skin rippled with bark-like scar tissue. "Wrong sacrifice," Javier's voice echoed from the walls. Carlos pulled her back as the still cracked, spewing a geyser of black mezcal that solidified mid-air into Marisol's shape-charred habit, eyes like smoke. Her fingers grazed Nelly's jaw, cold and final. "You cannot kill a prayer," Doctora starred, asterisk, "only drink it," asterisk. The chamber collapsed. They escaped as the volcano's crown split, agave fields below rippling into a verdant scream. The scar ate her. Bark-gray ridges spread from Nelly's chest, sprouting fibrous hairs that bled resin when plucked. Abuela sealed the ranch's mirrors, but Nelly caught glimpses. Her reflection now showed a cactus woman, arms studded with thorns, eyes reduced to sap-filled slits. Carlos stopped reacting. His pupils had developed a filmy sheen, as if mucus shielded them from things he refused to see. Guatemala's Santa Maria volcano erupted, not with lava, but a geyser of black agave nectar. Aerial footage showed the viscous flood swallowing villages, victims' limbs stiffening mid-scream into thorned columns. Hashtag Skeleton Vine trended alongside Miracle Cures influencers hawked detox mezcal rinses that dissolved their followers' jawbones. Nelly isolated the cure in Abuela's thread. Marisol's hair, woven with Sor Ines spindle, emitted a subsonic hum that disrupted the hymn's proteins. But they needed more yards of it. Carlos tracked the hair's origin to a convent prison in Puebla, where Inquisition-era nuns were interred in crypts lined with lead to contain their unclean essences. The lead kept something in. Breaking in was too easy. The lock crumbled like ash. The crypt's walls rippled with faint, wet pulses. Nellie's scar throbbed in rhythm. They found 8 coffins. 7 held skeletons swaddled in moldering habits. The 8th lid was shattered from within. Inside, clumps of black agave pulp and a scalp braided into the floor tiles. Nellie pried it loose. The braid squirmed, each strand wriggling like a worm dipped in ethanol. Carlos' phone buzzed a live feed from Mexico City. The Metropolitan Cathedral's altar had cracked open, its fractures oozing the same nectar. Parishioners gathered to drink it, hymns warping into the protein chant. By noon, their choir's collective exhalations crystallized the air into dagger-like sugar shards. They re-entered the distillery. Carlos' orders now came from a Monsignor ex-Special Forces, who cited revelations and strapped grenades to his cassock. The vats had regenerated, bones knitting into cathedral arches over the new stills. The hymn here was deafening, vibrating fillings loose. Agents opened fire. The grenades ignited a flash inferno. But Marisol's shadow engulfed the flames, her silhouette drinking the heat. Nellie found the ledger again. Her name reappeared, this time underlined. Beside it, Carlos. "She's upgrading her collaborators," he muttered, lighting a cigarette. The flame caught his sleeve, spreading silently. He batted it out, skin peeling to reveal a lattice of agave fibers binding muscle. "Guess I'm Employee of the Month." Abuela waited at a highway chapel, its walls papered with retablos of the sick crawling to Marisol's feet. She'd woven the hair into a mantle, humming a Puripeka lullaby. When they burned her, the smoke carried her voice, asterisk now the rains bring it back. This, asterisk she shook the mantle, catches whispers. You must wear it inside out. The weave itched like fire ants. Nellie draped it over her scar. The bark skin softened. Her thorned joints straightened. But the mantle's weight doubled with each step. Marisol's whispers dripped into her ears. The hearth is generous, Doctora. It only wants what you owe, asterisk your thirst. Your asterisk screams. They lured Javier to the chapel. He came as a storm agave pollen thick as locusts, choking the air. Carlos tackled the swarm. Beetles shredded his hands to pith. But Nellie lunged, mantle swirling, and ensnared the core. Javier materialized, writhing, as she wound the hair braid around his neck. Where is she breathing? Asterisk he laughed, throat constricting. Everywhere. Nowhere. The hearth is a asterisk throat. He convulsed, body collapsing into beetles again. But the braid held a single beetle iridescent, engorged. It dissolved in Nellie's palm, leaving a molten gold ring stamped with Marisol's sigil. Midnight. The ring's band tightened. It pulsed in sync with Guatemala's eruption. Nellie studied it under infrared. The inner surface was engraved. El que bebe mi sangre, vive en mi. He who drinks my blood, lives in me. Carlos' voice rasped behind her. She's not offering immortality. She's offering membership. His teeth glinted black and serrated. Nellie hurled the ring into the chapel's holy water font. The water boiled. Steam coalesced into a crouched figure Marisol, unburned, youthful, offering a clay cup. Your turn, Doctora.